Washington ahead of his all-important meeting with President Trump at the White House. Tomorrow, Netanyahu will present President Trump with Israel's view on a deal or a military strike on the Islamic Republic. ILTV's Steve Leibowitz has the full story.
Unlike other recent Netanyahu trips to Washington, this time the Prime Minister will return home shortly after his meeting with Trump. The Prime Minister is scheduled to return to Israel Thursday noon, landing early Friday morning. The apparent reason for the rushed visit is to avoid being in Washington later on Thursday when Trump convenes his Board of Peace, where Netanyahu could be seen and photographed alongside regional leaders who have been heavily critical of Israel.
הנסיעה הזאת אנחנו נדון בשורה של נושאים, עזה, האזור, אבל כמובן בראש ובראשונה במשא ומתן עם איראן. אני אציג בפני הנשיא את התפיסות שלנו לגבי העקרונות במשא ומתן, העקרונות החשובים, ובעיניי הם עקרונות חשובים לא רק לישראל, אלא לכל מי שבעולם רוצה שלום וביטחון במזרח התיכון.
The urgent summit comes as talks between the United States and Iran are due to continue in Oman, with the possibility of an American military strike on Iran in place and awaiting orders. Israeli concern is now focused on the risk of a deal that leaves Iran's ballistic missile program untouched. Netanyahu will argue that the current talks are focused primarily on the nuclear file, while Iran continues to develop long-range ballistic missiles that pose what Israel describes as an existential threat. Netanyahu reportedly believes his personal relationship with Trump could be decisive. Senior Israeli officials say that in previous closed-door meetings, when the Prime Minister presented Israel's core security needs, Trump backed Israel fully. Netanyahu now wants to ensure that the president does not back away from red lines agreed upon in earlier summits and talks led by U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff. The Prime Minister is also expected to argue that this is an historic opportunity. Iran, he will say, is weakened, its regional proxies are under pressure, and its missile program must be curbed now, including limits on range and production to prevent future war. Netanyahu is also expected to signal Israel's willingness to support any American military action, framing Israel as a force multiplier rather than a liability.
Meanwhile, in Iran, executions are continuing and a fresh wave of arrests of political reformists. All the while, the regime continues to build up their ballistic missile arsenal. Let's take a look.
In Iran this week, authorities arrested several prominent figures identified with the reformist camp, including Azar Mansouri, head of the Reform Front coalition, along with two former parliamentarians. According to Iranian state media, they were detained on charges including acting against national security and coordinating with foreign media. The arrests were announced as part of what officials described as a crackdown on internal dissent. However, the so-called reformists are not an external opposition movement. They're a recognized faction within the structure of the Islamic Republic, operating under the same constitutional framework and ultimate authority of the supreme leader. The detentions come amid continuing public unrest and chants calling not for reform, but for an end to the system itself. In recent years, protesters have increasingly rejected the reformist hardliner divide and have called for regime change, with many expressing support for Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi as a transitional leader. Analysts note that throughout the history of the Islamic Republic, internal factions have been managed, marginalized, or temporarily targeted during periods of heightened pressure from the international community to give the illusion of change in the necessary direction, while the core power structure of the regime always remains intact. At the same time, Iran continues to advance its military capabilities. New reports show the regime is producing hundreds of ballistic missiles per month in underground facilities designed to protect its arsenal from potential strikes. The missiles include both liquid and solid fuel systems with ranges capable of reaching Israel and other regional targets. The expansion is taking place even as diplomatic talks with Western powers continue, and while Iran has refused to place limits on its ballistic missile program in any negotiation framework.
Well, as the negotiations continue between the U.S. and the Islamic regime in Iran, joining us now to discuss the latest developments is former Deputy National Security Advisor Chuck Freilich. Chuck, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure to have you on here. Where do you think things stand today with the Trump administration? Has any actual progress been made towards a deal, given the regime's actions and statements as well?
Well, I think where things stand is really something that's only knowable if you have direct access to President Trump's thinking. He keeps his cards very close to him, and he also is capable of changing his mind at any period, at any point. I think we're reaching a stage where a decision will have to be made. It doesn't have to be made this week or next week. I think Trump can still play for time here. The talks have begun. They made at least enough progress so that both sides expressed an interest to continue them. Whether the progress goes beyond the simple agreement to continue talking is as yet unclear.
Now, what would a successful deal actually look like for the United States? Because the reality is, of course, we know the regime can't be trusted to keep its word based on history. They're still executing Iranians throughout this week, even. So what would a deal look like?
Well, we know what we would like a deal to look like. And here, there's actually no daylight between the U.S. and Israel. There may be daylight in terms of what each side is willing to settle for. The ideal agreement would basically end Iran's entire military nuclear program, no enrichment whatsoever, removing the existing highly enriched uranium stockpile out of Iran, and some other measures on the nuclear issue. It will include a complete ban, at least on their long-range missiles, the ones capable of reaching Israel, and an end to their support for the various proxies in the region. Now, where there may be daylight between the sides is that Trump may wish to settle for a deal which focuses solely or primarily on the nuclear issue. Israel doesn't want to see the other two issues left aside, especially since at the moment, in the short term, the more pressing issue is actually the missiles and not the nuclear issue. It's, of course, the greater danger in the long term. It's truly an existential threat. But at the moment, the program hasn't advanced in any significant way since the attack in June. And the ballistic missile program, conversely, is progressing significantly, even rapidly. The good news here is that while they're building lots of rockets, lots of missiles, they have apparently not been able to rebuild the launcher arsenal. So they've got lots of missiles that they can fire on fewer launchers, which makes it harder for them to do so, to launch them, and somewhat easier for us to, or for the U.S. to attack them because there are fewer targets.
Well, we do see Prime Minister Netanyahu making an urgent trip to Washington now. In your take, what is Israel's concern here with the deal? You mentioned the hesitation about an only nuclear deal. Is it even theoretically possible that we would see Israel act alone militarily in the event that we don't see a good deal in Israel's eyes?
I don't think Israel has the freedom of maneuver today to do something against Mr. Trump's wishes. Now, if he's willing to okay an operation or just give a nod, even an unspoken yellow light, but something that's clearly understood, that's one thing. But I don't think we can act without the U.S. There's a possibility that this operation, just like in June, might end up being a joint operation. Unlike June, this time it would presumably be the U.S. the leading actor, with Israel providing additional support, whereas in June it was precisely the opposite.
All right, well, we will have to stay tuned and keep you updated on what happens with that. We'll be following the talks closely. But I want to thank you, former National Security Advisor Chuck Freilich. Thank you.
Thank you.
The story of the Jewish people has never been about standing still. It's a story of moving forward, of taking responsibility, of protecting what matters, no matter the challenge. That story is still being written today, not with swords, but with stewardship of the land, with the rule of law, and with a determination to secure Israel's future. And on the front lines of that mission stands Regavim. Regavim is a public movement dedicated to defending Israel's national lands and natural resources in the field, in the courts, and in the public square. Through research, on-the-ground action, and legal advocacy, Regavim works to uphold the rule of law and to ensure that Israel can grow, thrive, and remain rooted in its homeland.
The IDF says 4 Hamas gunmen were killed after emerging from a tunnel in southern Gaza's Rafah and opening fire on Israeli troops. The military says the incident took place during mop-up operations by the 7th Armored Brigade in eastern Rafah. Soldiers returned fire and eliminated all 4 attackers. No Israeli casualties were reported. The IDF called the attack a blatant violation of the ceasefire with Hamas and said operations are continuing to locate and destroy additional tunnel-based operatives. The army says dozens of Hamas fighters are still believed to be trapped underground in the area, with around 40 killed or captured in recent months. In a separate incident, the IDF says troops in northern Gaza shot and killed a Palestinian who crossed the yellow line and approached soldiers in a way that posed an immediate threat. Meanwhile, Palestinian sources report 2 dead and several wounded in an Israeli airstrike in Gaza City. The IDF has not commented on that report. Against this backdrop, Khan, public broadcaster, reports that Indonesian troops are expected to deploy to southern Gaza in the coming weeks as part of an international stabilization force. Several thousand soldiers are expected to arrive with no official deployment date set. Now, a new report is shedding light on how a private aircraft was used in U.S. deportation operations. The UK's Guardian reports that a luxury private jet owned by an Israeli-American billionaire and a major donor to President Donald Trump was used to deport Palestinians detained by U.S. immigration authorities to the West Bank. The report says the flights were carried out at the request of Washington, with Israeli security agencies approving the transfers. Here's what we know.
The jet at the center of the report is a Gulfstream aircraft owned by Gil Dezer, a Florida-based real estate tycoon and close ally of President Trump. According to The Guardian and Haaretz, the plane was used at least twice, in January and February, to transport more than a dozen Palestinians detained by ICE in the United States to Israel, where they were then transferred to the West Bank. A source told Haaretz that the request originated in Washington and that the Shin Bet approved the deportees following security screening. Dezer told The Guardian that the jet was privately chartered and that he was not aware of who was on board. The report has drawn international attention, particularly in Ireland, where the aircraft made a refueling stop. One deportee told The Guardian he was shackled during the flight and left at a West Bank checkpoint after living in the U.S. for nearly a decade.
Well, IDF and Shin Bet forces carried out multiple counter-terrorism operations across Judea and Samaria, arresting more than 20 terrorists and wanted suspects, including explosive manufacturers and arm dealers. In an undercover operation in the Samaria Brigade area, Gidonim unit fighters directed by the Shin Bet arrested a terrorist involved in the acquisition and possession of weapons who was planning attacks against IDF troops and Israeli civilians. 4 additional wanted suspects were also detained. In the Menashe Brigade area, Nachal Reconnaissance Forces, Border Police, and the Mitzada unit arrested 7 terrorists in the village of Yabad, who were involved in the manufacture of explosive devices and arms trafficking. In addition, operations across the region saw 9 more terrorists arrested, including 3 who attempted to attack Israeli forces. The IDF has stated it will continue proactive and determined operations to thwart terrorism throughout Judea and Samaria. Well, the IDF has released dramatic footage of last week's operation in Syria, when IDF forces located and destroyed a weapons warehouse belonging to the Islamic Jihad terrorist organization. IDF forces under the command of the 210th Division completed the nighttime operation in the village of Beit Jan in southern Syria. The forces located and destroyed numerous weapons in the warehouse, including firearms, mines, and communication equipment. Throughout the war and continuing during the ceasefire, the Islamic Jihad terrorist organization has been promoting terrorist activities against the State of Israel and its citizens in the northern sector. The operation is added to a series of operations carried out by the forces of the 210th Division with the aim of removing any threat and activity by various terrorist elements in the area and protecting the citizens of the State of Israel and in the Golan Heights in particular. Israeli President Isaac Herzog is in Australia this week, paying tribute to the victims of the Bondi Beach attack. During his trip, Herzog visited the Jewish community and the location of the massacre. But the Israeli president was met with massive crowds of violent protesters. The demonstration did not once focus on the tens of thousands murdered in Iran, for example. Instead, they took to the streets to protest the arrival of Herzog in Australia. ILTV's Devil Klein has the full story.
This was the scene at the Moriah College Jewish School in Sydney. Speaking to students, waving Israeli and Australian flags, Israeli President Isaac Herzog inspired the Jews of Australia with a touching visit. The purpose of the visit was to be with the community in mourning after the Bondi Beach at the Hanukkah celebration when ISIS-inspired shooters took the lives of 15 Jewish people. And this was the scene yesterday, a touching ceremony where President laid wreaths alongside his wife, paying his final respects to the victims. But this was the scene outside. Pro-Palestinian Australians saw fit to bombard the president on a trip meant to show solidarity and inspire a community in mourning, claiming Herzog was complicit in the deaths of Palestinians in Gaza. The death toll in Iran continues to climb, and uncertainty due to internet blackout is allowing the regime to execute its civilians. But for the people of Iran, not a single flag or chant was in sight. The Bondi Beach attack still stands as the most horrific attack committed on Australian soil in decades, and instead of mourning together with the community, police were forced to separate protesters and mourners.
What you saw last night was New South Wales police being confronted multiple times by a section of that crowd intent on disturbing and disrupting police lines. Now, what we can say today that we couldn't say yesterday is that we had concurrently 7,000 mourners down at the International Convention Centre who were mourning the horrible events of the 14th of December with the President of Israel. New South Wales Police had to keep both protesters and mourners separate so that, as disturbing as the scenes were last night on the news, they weren't even worse as a result of thousands of people clashing together on the streets of Sydney.
Several protesters were arrested in the clashes, and the empathy of the Australian people proved once again to be selective and biased.
Today, we're joined by Eliyahu Kleinman, who works closely with overseas buyers navigating the Israeli real estate market. With so many foreigners investing from abroad, we wanted to talk about the most common mistakes that buyers make, and just as importantly, the opportunities that exist in the Israeli market right now. Eliyahu, thank you so much for joining us today. Pleasure to have you here again. You work with many international buyers. From your experience, what are the most common mistakes that foreigners make when buying property here in Israel?
So basically, there are two main mistakes that we see the clients are doing. First of all, they're assuming that Israel is another star at the American flag, and they think that the Israeli real estate market is like, like America or any other place in the world. So when you start assuming things in life and you don't really understand how the process works, how the market works, speaking with the professionals like attorneys who specialize working with the international clients, realtors as us, mortgage brokers, and so first of all, that's the number one mistake, because we're here to protect you as a buyer. And the second thing, that when people look in a deal, look at the price, and they don't look in the big picture. Or what are my guarantees? Who is the builder? And there are so many things that need to be discussed, that it's not only about the price. You need to see the big picture, that eventually what you're buying is what you're going to get. So I think those are the main two things that really to protect the buyer and avoiding making mistakes.
Now, how important is planning? I mean, anytime you're buying a property, you need to plan in advance. But how important is that for an overseas buyer?
First of all, ask yourself, why do I want to buy? Why did I left my contact information about the purchasing in Israel? Once you understand the why, planning your budget, planning if you want to make aliyah, don't make aliyah, but plan your timeline, and really understanding the full picture, as I said before making any decision.
Now, right now in the Israeli market, there are a lot of opportunities. Can you tell us a little bit about what's happening here in Israel, opportunities that may exist for foreign purchasers?
So let's not forget that we are after 2 years, almost 3 years of war, hostages, high interest. Now it's a buyer's market. And so people ask me, okay, what does it mean to be in a buyer's market? So there are main three things. The first one is price. You can get a better price to be negotiated with the seller. Second are the terms. If it's the terms of the deal, the payment plan, index, upgrades in the apartments. And the third thing is that when you come to purchase something, you're not in a rush that the apartment will be taken tomorrow. You have the time actually to choose the apartment, to choose the property that will be good for you, because there are days when it's a seller's market, and it happens a lot, that a client is overseas, it comes the next day, and it says, look, the apartment, either the price went up or the apartment is sold. So definitely in today it's a buyer's market. We don't know for how long it's going to stay, but now we feel after the war, hostages are back, we feel the prosperity. And I really believe that if someone wants to purchase an apartment in Israel, that's a very good timing for him now. And that's why we're here, to give you the best service and the best deal that suits you as a buyer.
Sounds like it's actually a really good time to enter the Israeli real estate market. But I do want to ask you, before I let you go, if there's someone watching who is interested in purchasing property here in Israel, what advice would you have for them?
Speak with professionals, do your homework, build your team to make this process. It's not an easy process, but if you work with the right professionals and you communicate with them, we're here to make it much smoother and enjoyable.
And you're here to streamline, you guys work to streamline all of those things that you mentioned, the common pitfalls, not working with the professionals, and the different obstacles that may come up in purchasing a property, right?
As I said, it's about communication and culture and understanding. Once you try to, not going by the book, so eventually, we heard a lot of people saying, look, I purchased an apartment in Israel, but it's not what I've been told. Because when you try to do things not in the right way, there will be surprises. As I said, it's not like buying abroad. But
nonetheless, a good time to buy, right?
It is a good time to buy, because smart investors and smart buyers know when everyone is quiet and when it's a buyer's market, that's the time to buy. Because when prices are going up and it's a seller's market and everything, is there, so you're going to get less for your money, or you're going to be your position is weaker.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Sorry to cut you off there, Eliyahu. You can learn more about buying property and working with Eliyahu here with his professional consultation to make sure that your investment is planned, protected, and, of course, strategic from day one. Feel free to scan the QR code to get in touch. At this hour, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's Wings of Zion aircraft is due to land in Washington ahead of his all-important meeting with President Trump at the White House.